Hi everyone! For the third portion of our shirt tutorial, we'll be sewing the shoulder seams to attach the front and back shirts together. We will also sew and attach our convertible collar and finally close up the side seams. We're going to be top stitching our yoke seam, which means sewing 1/4 inch above the yoke seam so that we're stitching through all layers of fabric, including the seam allowances, which are now hidden between the two layers. Top stitching is not only a nice aesthetic addition to a garment, but it also will help those seam allowances stay in their appropriate directions without the seam trying to roll downwards. Here's my yoke seam. I'm going to be stitching 1/4 inch over from the seam on the side of the yoke. No backstitch is necessary. We're now ready to attach our fronts to our back at the shoulder seams, and we're going to do this in a manner that causes all the seam allowances at the shoulder to be hidden completely inside the yoke, and this will give us a perfectly clean finish at the shoulders on both the outside as well as the inside of the garment. To do this, we're going to use one of my favorite techniques that I call the hot dog in a bun trick. We'll be positioning the garment in a way that causes the two yokes to be sort of like a bun, and enclosed inside will be the entire garment rolled up like a hot dog. Mine will be a veggie dog. You want to start with your back laid out with the right side facing up, and then you'll place each front on top of the back with the right sides together, matching the fronts to the back at the shoulder seams. Starting from the very bottom of the garment, you're going to grab both the backs as well as the fronts, and you're going to start to roll. And we're rolling and rolling. We're making a nice tight roll. This is our hot dog. You're going to keep rolling all the way up until you're right about here at the yoke seam. Then, at the shoulders, you want to grab your front as well as just the first yoke. Only this yoke right here, not the second one below, and hold them together on both sides. So just the front and one of the yokes. Then you're going to take the lower yoke, and here comes the bun. Flip it forward and wrap it completely around to the top so that you're bringing all the shoulder seams together. You should have 1, 2, 3 layers of fabric so that the yokes are on the outside of your shirt front. It will actually even be 4 layers right here at this section where you have the facing. You're going to align all those layers of fabric at the shoulder seam and pin. So we'll come to one end of our seam, perfectly match the corners of everything, and pin perpendicular to the shoulder seam. Then come all the way down to the other end of the seam and do the same thing. Match up all 3 layers exactly at the corner. And again. Then we want to come to the middle, so give it a little tug to make sure all your layers are nice and evenly distributed, and check that all the edges are matched up, and we'll pin once more right in the middle of the shoulder seam. Shoulder seams tend to sit on the bias of the fabric, which is the diagonal direction of the fabric where things are capable of stretching more. So even though it seems like a pretty straight and easy seam, it'll definitely help you out to have a few more pins on this one because it can tend to get distorted and run away from you while sewing. So we're going to split these sections up one more time so that we have a total of 5 pins in each shoulder seam. And then we'll repeat the same pinning process on our other shoulder seam. After your shoulder seams are pinned with your hot dog nicely wrapped up inside that bun created by the yokes, you simply have to sew across both shoulder seams with 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at both ends of each one. Your main thing you want to be aware of as you do so is just being sure that all the fabric of your hot dog is out of the way. You want to be sure that the bodies of your shirt don't creep into your seam anywhere, so you want that roll tucked away from your sewing. So I'm just going to sew both of my shoulder seams at 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching both ends. After sewing the shoulder seams of your hot dog in a bun, now is the magical moment. We're going to release the hot dog from the bun and we will have a fully clean finished yoke with all seam allowances hidden inside. So you just want to come to one end, turn the yoke back, and just work at it carefully, bit by bit, pulling the hot dog from the inside to the outside now. And wait for it, wait for it. Ta-da! We now have our fronts attached to the back at the shoulder seam, and you'll see that from both the inside as well as outside of the garment, we have a fully clean finish. We're going to be top stitching along the shoulder seams that we've just completed, but first we'll want to press that seam from both sides. So I'm going to press from the inside of the garment first, and I want to be sure that I'm really pulling the back away from the front so that we don't catch any little extra folds of fabric along our seam. Then you want to flip the whole garment over and press from the other side as well. Next, we'll be top stitching along both of our shoulder seams on the side of the yoke so that we're stitching through all the seam allowances that are enclosed inside. For this top stitching though, we'll just be doing an edge stitch, meaning 1/16 of an inch away from the seam. To sew the collar, you should have 2 collar pieces cut out. One of them is the upper collar, sometimes also called the top collar, and the other is your under collar. The upper collar will have fusible interfacing already attached because we cut it as a block fuse. The under collar does not take any interfacing. Despite the fact that they look exactly the same, these 2 collars are actually slightly different in their size and shape. The under collar is always created to be a tiny bit smaller around the outer collar edge than the upper collar is. The reason for that is this helps the collar roll downwards nicely as the garment is being worn. It helps the roll stay in place without having excess fabric build up on the underlayer, which is the under collar. That is why it is always made slightly smaller than the upper collar. To identify one from the other, aside from the fact that we know we already have fusible interfacing on the upper collar, the notch that gets matched up to the center back neck is different on the 2 collars. Your upper collar will always contain a single notch at the center back neckline, and your under collar will always contain a double notch at the center back neckline. To sew our collar, we're going to take the 2 collars and place them with right sides together. When we do so, we can already start to see that slight offset of size between the two pieces. See how when I match up the outer collar edge, the lower edge, which is where we sew the collar onto the neckline, is actually different. We can see that little 1/8 of an inch offset of the upper collar being larger. So to pin our collars together, we are going to match up these 3 sides and pin them together, but we want to see that the bottom edges do not match up. For our first pins, let's come way out to the collar tips. Make sure the edges of the fabric are perfectly matched, and then kind of orient your pin diagonally inward from each collar tip. Next, we'll pin the lower corners the same way. So pull the fabric to match up the edges and pin. Same thing over here. Then we'll come to the top edge of the collar, and we want to make sure that we match up the single notches that both pieces contain and pin right there at the notches. Then we'll come to this section and pin right in the middle. And repeat the same on this half. Just to help us out a little bit more, let's go ahead and pin one more time between each of these spaces. Once the collar is pinned, it'll be ready to sew. We're going to be sewing all the way around these 3 sides at 1/4 inch seam allowance, but we're not going to sew across the bottom neckline opening. This will stay unstitched. We want to carefully pivot at both of these corners when we come to them, and we'll be sure to do a back stitch at the beginning and end of our seam. Starting from our first corner, we're going to stitch around our collar edge at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Begin with a back stitch and come forward. And as we come up to the first corner here, our collar tip, we want to be sure to stop about 1/4 of an inch from the bottom edge. And what'll help you have a perfect pivot point is to lower your stitch length to about 1 millimeter for the collar tips. This will not only help us come forward to the exact perfect spot, but having that slightly smaller stitch at the collar tip will actually reinforce that area because we're going to be clipping this excess away and turning the collar right side out. So having those tighter stitches at the corner will actually serve that purpose as well. As I rotate with my needle down and come forward, I want to see that I am also aligned with 1/4 inch as I continue to the next side. I still have a little bit excess fabric over there, so I'm going to turn back and come forward just one more stitch. And now we'll try it again, and that looks good. I'm right on my 1/4 inch line now, and I can continue forward. But I'm going to go back to a regular stitch length of 2.5 for the majority of the sewing. It's only the tips of the collar that we want to have that teeny tiny stitch. Coming up to the next collar tip, I'm going to go ahead and lower that stitch length right about now to 1 millimeter again and just creep forward till I'm at the perfect spot. Let's see. That looks great. I'm going to continue forward and now go back to my 2.5 millimeter stitch. And as I come to the end, finish with a back stitch. To give us a nice sharp collar edge along the top, we're going to be understitching along the main length of the long part of the collar edge. To do so, we're going to be understitching the seam allowance onto the under collar side. So to help prepare us for that, we're going to use the iron to first press the seam allowance towards the under collar. I'm going to use the sleeve board as support underneath because this will help the rest of the collar kind of fall away from the part that I want to press. I'm just going to pull it open, and I'll start from the center and work my way out towards either side as far as I can get. But I just want to feel underneath that the seam allowance is going towards the under collar side, which is the one with the double notch and no fusible interfacing. So I want to go right over that seam to press it in place and just get as far up into the corner as I reasonably can. Then we'll turn it around and do the same thing from the other side. To understitch the collar, we won't be able to get all the way up into the collar tips on both ends, but we still want to get as far as we can in either direction. So I'm going to bring my collar in. It's spread open so that I have the under collar and the seam allowance on this side and the upper collar on this side. And I'm going to be edge stitching on the under collar and seam allowance side. So that means sewing a 1/16 of an inch over from the seam. But I want to kind of back it up into this tight area as far as I can reasonably get while still keeping my collar and my seam nicely spread open. So right about here is probably the limit. And I want to begin with a little back stitch. And now I'll continue forward with my understitch. As we come up to the other side, your goal is to also just sew as far as you reasonably can while still keeping your understitch correct. Really spread it open. Sometimes you'll think you're done, and then as you come forward a little bit more, you'll realize that you can continue creeping up a bit. Okay. That's probably about my limit on this end, so now I'm going to finish by going backwards a few. We want to do a little clipping at the tips of our collar to remove some of this excess fabric before we turn those corners out. So I'm going to take my shears and, coming to this corner, I'm going to look at the corner of my stitches and do a diagonal snip across the seam allowance almost to the stitches, but being sure to not actually cut them. And then in addition to that snip, I'm going to come from either side and kind of taper off a little bit more excess on both sides of the corner. First across, and then skim, and skim. Now we can take our point turner, and as we flip the collar right side out, we'll get up in there to pop it out nicely. Be very careful though that you don't overly stab this through. Okay. As you're trying to get your corners nice and sharp, in addition to using the point turner, another good technique is to come and across the seam direction, just sort of pinch and roll with your fingertips. And sometimes that'll kind of pull a little bit more excess fabric outward. To press the collar, have the under collar facing up, and you're going to grab it and bring it down to now align the bottom edges, which are the neckline. As we pull those edges to meet, you should see that around the outer collar edge where we've sewn our seam, you want to see a tiny bit of the upper collar rolling around towards the under collar side. So see how we can see that tiny little sliver of neon? That's our upper collar rolling around by that 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch, and that's what we're going for as we press. So with the bottom edges matched up, then you'll take your iron and press over the top of the whole collar. Before attaching our collar, we want to go back to our neckline on the main body of our garment, and we want to stay stitch along the back neckline. We already stay stitched the front neckline early on, but we weren't able to do the back until after our shoulder seams were sewn. So let's go and do that now. From one shoulder seam to the other, I'm going to follow the back neckline, sewing about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And we're doing this to attach the two layers of the yoke together to make them easier to work with as we attach the collar. To further prepare our collar for the next step, you want to come to the upper collar side, and along the neckline here, we want to mark 1/4 of an inch, and we'll use the iron to press that under. So starting from the end, on the upper collar side, I want to mark 1/4 of an inch, pivoting my ruler so that I'm following the curve of the neckline. This will be a guideline for pressing at the iron. After making my marks, I'm going to take my collar, and it's kind of easier to do this with the under collar facing up, but you want to open it up because it's the upper collar that we're pressing. You just want to fold that 1/4 inch towards the inside of the collar and press it with the iron. We won't be able to get all the way up to the corner here, but just kind of start maybe about 1 inch away from the ends of the collar and press. To start pinning your collar, lay your shirt out with the right side of the garment facing up, and then place your collar on it with the upper collar facing up. We're going to be pinning just the under collar onto the neckline of our garment. So that means you have the right side of the under collar against the right side of the shirt. The first point that we want to match up are the double notches at the center back neck. So make sure your notches are aligned and pin. Next, we have these 2 notches a couple inches further out from either side of the center, and these are meant to match up to your shoulder seams. So we're going to take that notch and bring it around to match the shoulder seam, still only pinning the under collar to the neckline. Keep the upper collar out of the situation. And then we could even continue onward to pin the end of the collar to this point right here. Remember we made that little clip in the seam allowance? That is exactly the point at which you will match up the end of your collar. So come right to there and really kind of pull everything open and pin as close to this seam line that's the end of the collar as you can get. So that was 1/2 of it. Now we're going to walk the other side of the collar around and pin the same way. After you have those 5 crucial points pinned, then you're going to go and continue to split up the spaces between them with more pins, being sure to really pull the edges of the fabric together between the under collar and the actual neckline. Okay. Once your collar is nicely pinned in place, it's ready to sew. And we're going to be sewing along this edge that we just pinned at 1/4 inch seam allowance. We'll want to be sure to back stitch at both ends, which are the ends of the collar. And you really want to be sure that every step of the way you are pulling the edges of the fabric to match. Even if there's a section where there isn't a pin, really just align those edges as best as we can. For this next seam, the hardest part is really just getting set up and getting everything perfectly positioned, because we really have to open this up. This is our upper collar, and from the seam downward is the under collar. So we want to be sure that the seam line that we sew right now comes exactly up to this stitch line that we have right here, which is the side edges of the collar. We don't want our stitches to go further than that or to not come all the way up to it. We're going to be sewing 1/4 inch inward from this edge, so we want to begin by doing our back stitch right up to that stitch line before we then come forward. So just open it up, get it underneath, and I want to make sure I'm lined up with 1/4 inch over here. And I'm going to begin by going backwards right up to that stitch line and then continue forward at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Also be careful as you come forward on this one that the garment over here off to the left doesn't creep up under where you're sewing and catch any awkward folds. So you really want to be using your sense of touch and feel again. Each area as you come to it, feel with your fingertips and make sure you don't feel any strange folds underneath happening. As we come around and we're about to finish, we also want to be sure to pull this side forward. We're taking the upper collar and pulling it forward and open so that we can really see this stitch line right now, because that's exactly where we want to end and do our back stitch. So come right up to the seam line, there, and now backwards. For the upper collar, we're going to be taking that fold, that crease that we already did with the iron, and bringing it to meet our stitch line where we sewed the under collar on. Rather than working our pins from one end all the way to the other, sometimes the collar could get kind of dragged and pulled downwards and it'll end up looking twisty when you're done. So I find that the best first pin to do is right here in the center. So you want to look for the little single notch that's on the upper collar and perfectly center it in the middle of the double notch that you have for the under collar. And again, just bringing that fold exactly to the stitch line. And it should be the lower stitch line. The upper stitch line was just our stay stitch. So we're talking about this bottom one, which is the actual seam of the under collar. So bring those together. And then pin in place. Now we'll come all the way up here to the end. And we're going to continue the same idea, but you just have to put a lot of care into the end here to tuck everything in neatly. So I want to take the seam allowance of my undercollar and make sure it's nicely tucked inside everything. And then you're bringing your fold to kind of wrap around it and downward, nice and clean on top of your seam line. And pin. Then we'll come to about halfway between those two, bring the fold to the seam line, and pin again. Right here, we'll go halfway, fold to the seam line, pin in place. Same thing over here. And pin. And honestly, for the collar, I'd say you're even better off and more likely to have major success if you pin, 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 pin again. Yes, it's a lot, but the pins are there to help you. Okay, so that was half of our collar. That was pinning from the center back out to one end, and you'll want to repeat the same pinning process for the other half of the collar before we will then sit down and sew it. As we sew, we're going to be doing an edge stitch just above the fold, so a 1/16 of an inch above the fold, and we'll have a back stitch at the beginning and end of the collar. Starting at the beginning of my collar, we're going to edge stitch a 1/16 of an inch above the folded edge all the way down. And I want to start and finish with a back stitch. So I want to begin right about here so that I have room to go backwards right up to the beginning first. All right, coming up to the end and back stitch. After sewing, go ahead and give your collar a final press just to help it set along the neckline seam. The next step of our garment will be to sew the side seams. The side seams are pretty straightforward. We just want to orient them so we have the right sides of the fabric together, and we'll be doing a plain seam at 1/2 inch seam allowance down both sides. So I'm going to take my shirt and flip it around so that I'm placing the right sides together of the front and back portions of the shirt. Okay, so we'll pin this side first. Just want to match up the beginning and pin, match the end, and pin, and then we continue matching the edges and pin in the middle of the seam, and then in the middle of these two, and in the middle of these two. And now we'll repeat the same pinning process on the other side seam. Good to go with the pinning, so again, we're just going to go at 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching both ends of our seam. After sewing your side seams, the next step will be to simply press the seam allowances open. So, first pass your iron just over the top. From the wrong side, open up the seam allowances. And then finish by pressing from the right side as well. Repeat for both side seams.